Penguin Random House Audio presents A Burning in My Bones, the Authorized Biography of Eugene Peterson, by Winn Collier. Read for you by Richard Poe, with a preface and coda read by the author. The words are fire in my belly, a burning in my bones. Jeremiah 29. The Message.
Preface. On the flight home from Montana in October 2016, I assumed I'd seen Eugene and Jan for the last time. He was drawing his circle close, severely limiting any commitment so he could devote his diminishing energy to Jan and the family. I began to ponder how one day Eugene's story would be told, reflecting on how I hoped the telling would do more than outline the facts and highlights, but would give a sense of the man, a personal encounter, even if only through ink and paper. At the encouragement of a friend, I wrote Eugene, telling him my thoughts. A couple of weeks later, I picked up the phone and heard Eugene's soft, raspy voice on the line. There was nothing Eugene was less interested in than a biography. The thought of it makes me tired, he said at first. But the more we talked, the more I heard energy rising in his voice. Okay, he said, after 15 or 20 minutes. I think you should do this, Winn. I'll help you. And he did. Eugene gave me complete access to himself, his family, and 8 decades of papers and journals and manuscripts and letters. And for 3.5 years, I've known the joy and the trepidation of researching and writing Eugene's story. I'm so very grateful. This story leans heavily on Eugene's papers and journals, as well as scores of personal interviews and published works.
Introduction. They become what they behold. William Blake. Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. A few minutes after 7 a.m., with sun streaming through her kitchen windows on a fresh Maryland day, Jan Peterson scooped hot eggs onto 5 plates, next to scrapple and fried apple rings. "Eric," she called, "go tell Dad breakfast is ready." "Yes, ma'am," Eric answered. The oldest Peterson boy ran to the top of the stairs that led down to his father's home study and stopped short. His dad would be intensely focused and immersed in quiet. With a 9-year-old's mischief, Eric tiptoed down. The basement smelled of must and old print. He stepped onto the chilly tiled floor and catwalked with a burglar's stealth to his dad's study door. Most days Eugene spent an hour before daybreak reading scripture and a second hour reading commentaries. A hand-me-down desk sat under a single window beside a long bookshelf packed to the ceiling. Its books were arranged mostly by author: Barth, Dostoevsky, Newman, Teresa of Avila. A rocking chair, the favorite seat for reading, sat in the corner. Fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling, but Eugene rarely flipped on the cold bulbs. A lamp on the desk shed a warmer glow. The old communion table from their church, Christ Our King, sat against the wall, holding a pottery chalice and paten ready for wine and bread. Alongside the Eucharist dishes sat an Italian fiasco, long emptied of Chianti, holding a single white candle, with a year's worth of wax splattered over the straw basket covering the dark glass. A monk's cell. Dad's space. Gene's space. Pastor Pete's space. Eric turned the knob slowly, silently. He peered through the crack. And even now, Eric's eyes turn moist as he tells me the memory while we sit together. A small, woven rug lay on the tile floor before his dad's desk. Candlelight flickered from the wine bottle. Eugene rested on his knees with a tallit, the tasseled Jewish prayer shawl, wrapped around his shoulders. A Hebrew psalter splayed in front of him. He rocked gently, engrossed in the world of the Scriptures, surrendering to ancient prayers. Eric watched, hushed. He slowly closed the door and crept back upstairs to the clink of forks against plates. Only a boy, but he knew he'd witnessed something holy. Part 1. 1. Montana. There is nothing but a mercantile and a saloon, one building on either side of the street, and a slow, winding river working through the valley. A cow moose and her calf standing in the river behind the mercantile. And still no sign of life, no people. We knew immediately that this was where we wanted to live, where we had always wanted to live. We had never felt such magic. Rick Bass. Winter. Notes from Montana. In 1902, Andre and Juditha Odegaard Hoyland loaded their pots and pans, a bundle of clothes, and a few family heirlooms into a trunk and a couple of canvas bags. After wrapping their 9 children in heavy coats to shield them from Atlantic winds and the spray of icy salt water, they boarded a steamer in Stavanger, Norway, and watched the coastland cliffs fade to mist. Andre had made this voyage once before, working in the steel mills in Pittsburgh 2 years earlier to save enough money to move his family. Eugene's maternal grandparents sailed, perhaps on the Norgee or the Thingvaller, to Ellis Island and entered the harbor under the welcome gaze of Lady Liberty. New York City pulsed with the mass of humanity, and the family was immediately exhilarated and unnerved. Pulled by the westward migration, they cobbled together train passage from New York to St. Paul, Minnesota, maneuvering multiple connections. Finally, they boarded the Great Northern Railway, that massive feat willed into existence by James Hill, the empire builder. Crammed into their tight compartment, the 11 Hoylands churned past the lakes of Minnesota, across the plains, and then through the badlands of North Dakota, before they finally stopped 50 miles from the Canadian border in Kalispell, Montana. Only a decade old, young Kalispell boasted a train depot for the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway, the Mill Creek Sawmill, the West Hotel, rooms for $2 per night, a livery, and the Conrad National Bank. Harry Stanford, Kalispell's first chief of police, listed 23 saloons, half a dozen gambling joints, and a like number of honky-tonks, 2 Chinese laundries, and the same number of Chinese restaurants, and 4 general stores. Early one 4th of July morning, George Stannard, a local gunsmith, rolled a 220-pound cannon lifted from Fort Benton into the thoroughfare and lit the fuse, causing panicked neighbors to run out of their houses in their bathrobes. However, the allure for the Hoylands was primal, with the granite mountains' jagged spires piercing the skies, the winter white clinging to the frozen earth, the summer's verdant forests and azure lake. It was as if they'd come home. Andre, a cement worker, poured Kalispell's first sidewalks, and also served as a pastor, helping form Kalispell's first Assemblies of God church. In addition, he was a writer, penning pastoral articles for Norwegian newspapers in Norway, Montana, and Seattle. When Andre and Juditha Hoyland first cast their eyes on the vast and magnificent Flathead Valley, however, they couldn't have imagined how this place would shape the generations to follow, how this ground would form their grandson, Eugene. This wild country, with craggy, impenetrable terrain and a history of vigilante justice, raucous mining camps, and violence between encroaching settlers and indigenous nations, Bitterroot Salish, Kootenai, and Pend d'Oreille buried many settlers. Kalispell was still a tough frontier outpost, with all the hard, sordid characters you'd imagine. Several years after the Hoylands arrived, Fred LeBeau held up William Yoakum and his son Riley on their homestead, intending to loot their guns and provisions. However, when the Yoakums didn't cooperate, he shot both men in the gut. After a guilty verdict, the sheriff hung LeBeau on a gallows outside the county jail, with the Kalispell Bee offering this headline: "Execution of Fred LeBeau was not at all exciting. No thrills, and mighty few kicks by the victim of law's revenge." A rough place. But the land's natural beauty overwhelmed the more sordid human element.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?